pleasure to be here. I'm a recovering Catholic, but it doesn't take away from the pleasure of seeing Canterbury Cathedral. I'm here to call your attention to my latest book to be published in Britain, which is True Hallucinations. It's a bit different than the other book. The other book was a didactic argument directed toward the uninitiated in the matter of consciousness alteration, trying to inject my version of sanity into the debate about the role of drugs, especially psychoactive drugs, in human society. This book is a travel narrative, adventure, reads like fiction, but God's truth, it's all, every word of it happened. To the best of my ability, I told it as it came down. And what makes it interesting to me, and I hope interesting to you, is that it skirts the edge of what is possible. The main message of this book is that if you will probe the edges, if you will seek the unusual, if you will leave behind the conventions and confines of your tribe, then there are amazing things to be learned out there in the jungles, out there on the fringes of pharmacological functioning. For me, the holy grail of my intellectual life up until 1971 was the search for a violation of ordinary physics. That's how I put it. I grew up on science fiction and, as I said, watered-down Catholic theology and so forth. And slowly I came to have a great interest in science. But my interest in science tended toward the paranormal. And I satisfied myself fairly early that it was not to be found in any of the conventional modes. My efforts at demonic conjuration at age 12 failed miserably. My efforts to contact flying saucers a year or two later failed miserably. And so as I searched the avenues of experience, ultimately I came to, through your own Aldous Huxley, to the phenomenon of psychoactive plants and substances. And in the 60s, these things were presented as sort of accelerators for psychotherapy, fuel for the inner voyage. It was presented as the next step beyond birth control and television was to be LSD, this marvelous product of the laboratory, this marvelous production of scientific industrialism. But when I began to look into this phenomenon, I discovered that this is not something new, this alteration of consciousness with substances. It is, in fact, the world's oldest ecstatic technique. Welded to shamanism, it's the world's oldest religion. It is, in fact, how religion was practiced for the first 500,000 years of its existence before it fell into the hands of beady-eyed, beastly little priests with laundry lists of moral do's and don'ts. And then they sort of muddied the water. Because I think what religion is direct personal experience of the transcendental. That's what it is. And the way it's approached is by transcending culture, transcending boundaries between oneself and the predicaments of other people, between oneself and nature, between oneself and the unconscious. And I set out to experience as many of these psychedelic chemicals as possible because I wasn't entirely satisfied with LSD. Aldous Huxley and Havelock Ellis had set me up to expect fantastic visionary vistas, jungles, alien worlds, ruined planets, machine-like labyrinths. LSD wasn't cutting the mustard for me. It promoted complex thoughts, reveries, insights, but not vision. And then a friend of mine who fate led to be a rare book dealer in Fulham, but who at that time was simply a rabble-rouser like myself, came to me one rainy evening in February, and he said, "Here's something you might be interested in." And I said, "What is this?" And he said, "DMT." He said, it's a new psychoactive compound. And I asked only one question. I asked, "How long does it last?" And he said, 5 minutes. And I, in my immense sophistication in these matters, said, "Fine, bring it on." And I proceeded to do a couple of puffs, and the colors in the room brightened. There was a sound like the crumpling of a bread wrapper, later analyzed as the soul leaving the body through the anterior fontanelle at the top of the head. That was one person's gloss on it. And I, with my eyes closed, I found myself confronting a kind of mandalic pattern, a floral pattern. Since we've come to call it the chrysanthemum, or simply the mum. I found myself propelled through this floral mandalic form into a kind of tunnel. And in this tunnel, the walls and floor, the ceiling and floor were pulsating. And where they would come together and touch, there would be a kind of glue-like connection formed, and then a kind of... and a door would open, another aperture would appear. I found myself tumbling down into some kind of space, and I had the distinct impression somehow I was underground. There was a dome-like room. Walls were crawling with geometric hallucination. But that was not what riveted my attention in this space. What seized my attention were what I call self-transforming machine elves, or tykes. They looked like self-dribbling jeweled basketballs. There were dozens of these things. You have to understand, less than 20 seconds before I had been sitting in my tatty student quarters in Berkeley. Now suddenly I was in the presence of something literally previously unimaginable to me. I mean, my categories were melting. An alien, non-human life in another dimension, 30 seconds into a psychedelic trip. It sounds like we're going to have a full plate here before the evening is over. These entities spoke to me in a kind of hyperdimensional glossolalia. And they said, "Do not abandon yourself to wonder. Do not give way to astonishment. Watch what we are doing. Do what we are doing." And what they were doing was using their voices, their singing, their chanting, to produce objects out of the air. Somehow they were in possession of a language which is beheld, not heard. For them, syntax is a pictorial enterprise, and they were insisting to me that this was an incredibly important teaching or revelation. And in that first encounter, I was horrified. I was stunned. I drew back, my eyes round with terror, because these things would come up to me and they would use their voices to make objects like Fabergé eggs, but in motion, objects that looked like they were made of ivory, glass, chalcedony, agate, gold, precious materials. They would come forward, look at this, look at this. And as my attention would fall into these objects, I realized that if I could bring a single one of these objects back to this world, nothing would ever be the same. It transcends argument. You would only have to hold it out and say, look at this. And people would say, that is impossible. It's impossible. And in fact, when I came down from this first experience, my Marxism, my existentialism, my positivism, my scientific materialism was in shreds. It couldn't survive the experience. And when I recovered from all this, I headed to the library. I also turned on my friends. And the conclusion was inescapable that this was an incredible frontier of some sort. To this day, what I am most puzzled by is how do they keep the lid on the existence of this stuff? No one has ever said to me, don't mention it. You're an initiate of a secret order. You must never hint of the existence of this. And yet, how, over 10,000 years of human history, could the nearby presence of an alien dimension so easily accessed be unknown? It was to me an incredible puzzle. So I headed for the library. What is DMT? This was the question to be answered. And then, as a practical matter, we had the impression it's terribly brief, done as I've described it. Just as you're getting comfortable, just as you're getting your terror under control, it begins to fall away. The elves draw back. The cosmic can-can dance is canceled. They all wave and say, déjà vu, déjà vu. They're moving away. So I headed for the library, and I discovered that DMT not only occurs in human metabolism. Every single one of us here tonight is carrying it around in our head. This is the catch-22 from the establishment's point of view. You're all subject to arrest and incarceration on this charge, if no other. I discovered that it is the commonest hallucinogen in nature, that it occurs in many plants and in animal metabolism. And further, I discovered that there was a tribe of Amazonian Indians called the Witoto who had a drug called ukuhe. This is a tribe that, as a consequence of the rubber atrocities of the early years of this century, has gone from 45,000 people to, in 1971, 5,000 people. My brother and I and friends decided that we would put aside our political agenda, our educations, and that we would go to the Amazon. because we felt if you could get in there for half an hour, you could come back with a something, a truth, an insight, a blueprint, a machine, an aphorism, a teaching, something that would shatter the assumptions of Western civilization the way a stick of dynamite would shatter a rotten apple. And we were self-defined as revolutionaries. This was during the height of the Berkeley Commune and revolt. And to shorten the story, we did this. We went to the Colombian Amazon. We shipped down the Putumayo River. We walked 110 kilometers overland. And I'm now into the narrative that this book deals with. This book, True Hallucinations, is the story of this expedition to the Amazon and its consequences. And still, for all that, I was essentially a debunker. One thing I've learned in this business is that the mystery is robust. It doesn't have to be protected. It doesn't demand that you avert its gaze. Nonsense must be protected. Phoniness cannot stand inspection. But the real mystery will survive an encounter with the positivist observer. So we found ourselves at a place called La Chorrera. And these Indians were very reticent to cooperate with us. There had been a murder there just a month before we got there. Two shaman brothers fell into a magical battle with another group of shamans, and one group smeared the top rung of a ladder with the raw resin from a DMT-containing tree. And when this shaman was repairing his roof, his sweaty hands gripping the rung of the ladder had absorbed some of this, and he had become semi-paralyzed and fallen from the ladder and been killed. So it was not really the moment for a bunch of large, long-haired, odd-smelling white people to land in the middle of this very delicate social ecology and begin asking probing questions about the secret initiatory drug of the Witoto. So we determined that we would have to live there for a few months just to establish our credentials, as it were. And in the mushrooms, in the pastures behind the mission at La Chorrera, there were mushrooms, psilocybin-containing mushrooms. And we began imbibing these. I had never had psilocybin. It was very rare during the 60s in the States. And psilocybin, which is 4-phosphoryloxy N-dimethyltryptamine, is a near relative of the very DMT, dimethyltryptamine, that we were there to study. Well, we arrived as naive rationalists. My brother, who's 4 years younger than me, now has a very extensive professional education in molecular biology, pharmacology, drug design. This is how he makes his living. At that time, he was a 20-year-old child, a dreamer, but he had a lot of obtuse information in circulation in his head. And after a few days of mushroom use, he came to me and he said, "You know what we could do with this stuff?" And he proceeded to outline an experimental procedure which was part science, part mysticism, part perhaps psychotic delusion. He said that you could use your voice to interact with these molecules while they were metabolizing in your body, and that through acoustical canceling, which is explained exhaustively in the book, you could not only force these molecules to take up residence permanently in the human body, which is radical enough as a proposition, but you could somehow force a kind of ontological transformation of the human organism. He called it giving birth to an idea, literally giving birth to an idea. He proposed that the soul could be condensed as a visible object in three-dimensional space. If any of you are Jungian psychologists, you may know Jung wrote in Psychology and Alchemy about what he called the rotundum, the round thing which spins, which is a symbol of the self. And Jung felt that the alchemical quest was really a quest for the soul. And then the categories of modern science arose, and the absolute ontological distinction between mind and matter was made, and this alchemical program of the 16th century was abandoned. But Dennis proposed to resuscitate this intent, and by a new method actually create this trans-dimensional object. And one of the things that we had discovered in researching our trip to the Amazon was that there were persistent rumors among the very remote tribes of the Amazon of a kind of shamanism that involved the production out of the body of a kind of violet fluid. Anthropologists have chosen to describe this with the rather unappetizing phrase, magical phlegm. We may think what we like about that, but anyway, the reports were that this material generated out of the body under extraordinary conditions of pharmacological intoxication could be used to cure, and that in fact people would regurgitate this material into a bowl, and that you could look into the bowl and there were stars in this stuff. And my brother said it's a trans-dimensional holographic fluid matrix of some sort. In other words, it literally is the stuff of the philosopher's stone. It has all and everything in it. It's a holographic condensation of time and space. It's the material of which the human soul is made. And if you're familiar with the literature of alchemy, you know there's this great concern to fix the stone. In other words, at a certain alchemical stage, the water of life, some kind of fluid, alchemical, transubstantiant material is produced. But that's not the end of the alchemical process. The end comes when the stone is fixed. And he said, out of the union of voice, mushroom, mind, and brain, we will build the stone. These are the tripartite, the quadripartite elements of the trans-dimensional vehicle. We will conquer death. We will end the distinction between the animate and the inanimate, between spirit and matter. We will, in fact, force the collapse of the historical vector and lead all humanity into hyperspace. To which I replied, you and who else? It seemed to me that he probably was losing his marbles. But this was the program that we had set out to investigate. The DMT had become the compass of our quest. It had led us to one of the most remote corners of the earth, a tryptamine-saturated rainforest with a shamanically sophisticated tribe in residence. And so I felt the way to proceed was to let him carry out the experiment, because I had high confidence that it would fail, and that was the way to put the matter to rest. So we began to make preparations toward this experiment. We were living at a Capuchin mission at the time, and we were waiting for some Witoto to vacate a house in the jungle and return to their more remote home. And when they did finally give up this hut, we occupied it and we prepared for the experiment. I will leave out the details because they are exhaustively described in the book, and the book is soon to be followed, I hope, in Britain by another book called The Invisible Landscape, which gives all the footnotes, all the technical glosses, in other words, the blueprints, the recipes. This is not a work of fiction or narrative, ultimately. It's an engineering program which I hope other people will explore. I'm perfectly willing to be corrected, enlightened as to our errors and naive mistakes, but on the other hand, I've been at this since 1971. It's quite a robust hypothesis, considering its grandiosity. The experiment was performed. He had said that at the moment the superconducting bond between the psychoactive molecule and the DMT and the DNA was formed, that this lens-shaped violet object, the stone, would appear, and that it would be under telepathic mental command. And he envisioned it as the alchemists envisioned the philosopher's stone, as an object, a material object, but one with the quality of mind. In other words, it could do anything. If you needed to take a shower, it becomes a shower head and warm water sprays out of it. If you're hungry, you eat it. If you need to go somewhere, you stretch it out and sit on it, and it takes you there. If you have a question, it answers. It can do anything that you can conceive of. What it is its mind become visible. The soul manifest at last outside the matrix of the physical body. So he performed the experiment, and what he said would happen didn't happen. But to my horror, disbelief, and amazement, the only other possibility I had entertained was that nothing would happen. And that was not the case either. He, at the conclusion of the experiment, began to spiral off into some mental universe only visible and accessible to him. I was as though a switch had been turned somewhere deep in my psyche, and information began to flow in this very complete, effortless, smooth, illuminating mode, not like any drug I'd ever experienced, but rather like what he said should have happened, a kind of accessing in to the universal mind. I could pose questions, and answers would be immediately provided from some invisible source. I didn't sleep for 9 days. I was completely ecstatic. Now, psychologists have a concept called folie à deux, with which they lunge for when told stories like this. But a folie à deux, a delusion of two, is usually a mother-daughter relationship and has to do with very complex neurotic interactions. Neither my brother nor I had any serious history or any history of mental illness. And into this social space following the experiment, there flowed an unbelievably bewildering cacophony of coincidences, synchronistic events, seemingly impossible things were going on. Just as an example, I would walk into the woods by myself. And I should tell you, previously I had made my living as a professional butterfly hunter in Indonesia. I would walk into the woods by myself, and I would hold up my arms, and butterflies by the hundreds would come and settle around me on the ground and on my body. And I had this immense sense of relief and affirmation, and tears of joy would cascade down my cheeks, and more tears, and more joy, and more tears, and more joy. And then a tiny thought: this proves I'm right. This proves we've got it. So then I would go back to the camp, to the others, who by this time were very, very concerned about our mental state, and I would invite them to accompany me into the forest, where I would then stretch out my hands to the trees and wait, and people would just turn away, aghast, say, he is over the top. This is getting worse by the minute. Slowly, Dennis coalesced back to a state of normalcy. It took him about 23 days, and it was very clear to me that it was no ordinary psychotic break, because it had this bizarre quality to it, which was there was nothing whatsoever wrong with him, except that everything he did, said, and thought was being run backwards, literally like a film. And he had said before the experiment, he said much, he raved for days before the experiment, but he had said, there is a possibility that there will be a reversal of the template of my personality. And so we called this episode The Reversal. And it was as though he had been flung to the outermost limits of the world of space and time, and then was slowly making a shamanic voyage back to his own body and identity at a certain place and a certain time. Each day, the domain in which he was operating grew smaller, so that on the first day, it was absolutely transcosmic. It was like Olaf Stapleton's The Star Maker or something like that. A day or two later, he was firmly within the confines of the solar system. And then he made a kind of reverse journey from the outer planets in toward the Earth, revealing all kinds of peculiar things along the way, such as that tryptamine fish swim in Harmine oceans on Neptune, and so forth and so on. I mean, let's take this with a little poetic license, folks. Finally, he became the entire terrestrial ecology, and then, further condensing himself, all human beings in all times and places, and finally limited to the Celtic tribe, and finally to House McKenna, and finally to the question, was he himself or was he me? And finally we got that sorted out. And then he was fine, except that he had an enormous and persistent distaste for experimenting on the edge of nature that stuck with him. But I didn't recover. This switch turned in me was like a pure revelation of the Logos, 24 hours a day. It spoke to me all the time. All I wanted to do was think. And I would go into the jungle and sit and think and think and think. And when I would get up from where I had been sitting, I would see that my restless, unconscious hands had selected and broken twigs and built small fires, set small fires. And I interpreted this as just an overflowing of the logos. But there was a message in all of this. And it was a message that I could never have imagined or anticipated. It was a message about the nature of time itself, what it is. And it began with a dialogue. Did you know, this is the mushroom speaking, did you know, I'll bet you did know, that every day is composed of 4 other days? I said, no, I didn't know that. It's never entered my mind. It began with these kinds of simple aphorisms and built toward what has become a mathematically formal theory of the structure of time that has been now placed before some of the most prominent mathematicians in the world. And though they may have distaste for method, no one can deny that the mathematics is novel, carefully thought out, impeccably correct. And it leads then to an overwhelming conclusion, which is that history itself is the anticipation of our approach to a higher dimension. That the reason our religions are haunted by images of apocalypse, the reason that Western religion insists so persistently and irrationally that God will enter history, is because the world described to us by scientific materialism is completely bogus. We are not chance witnesses to a meaningless universe. We are, in fact, central players on the cosmic stage, because what the universe cares about is novelty, and we represent a concrescence of novelty, orders of magnitude more intense than chipmunks, planetary ecologies, so forth and so on, because upon the foundation of organic organization, we have raised culture, coding systems, electronic technologies that knit the world into a single unified informational point. So it was essentially we hit the noetic jackpot. Our wish had been to understand, and somehow this wish was granted almost by an angelic descent. But the understanding that was delivered was so radically different from, the assumptions of Western society that I saw immediately that I would spend the rest of my life exploring these ideas, trying to understand them, and trying to debunk them. I am not a believer. The mystery does not require belief. And I am not in the Carlos Castaneda crowd or all these other New Age loose-headed screwballs running around. I have utter contempt for that. I'm appalled that I have to stand before you and announce the impending entry of the species into hyperspace. I never would have believed it, except that honest appraisal of my own experience leads to this conclusion. And I've generated a theory, which I won't flay you with tonight, but it's an ordinary theory, meaning it is mathematically formal, it is testable by experimental and empirical means. It is a theory that would replace the idea of time as a perfectly smooth, featureless surface with a fractal wave that carries with it the implication that the universe is a struggle between habit and novelty, and that habit builds up resistance to change, which is then suddenly and dramatically overcome by a plunge into novelty. And novelty, its ingression is soon halted by a return to habit. These are like two Manichaean forces, except that they are not locked in eternal battle. Novelty is winning. Novelty is winning, and that's why we stand here tonight at the center of a global electronic culture that is the inheritor of 10,000 years of conscious civilization, because novelty is both being produced and being conserved. And what these psychedelics do, I think, is they simply lift one's point of view into a higher dimension, not metaphorically, literally into a higher dimension, so that the future is no more obscure than looking to the left. The past is no more obscure than looking to the right. All space and all time can be beheld if you can stand in hyperspace. This is how shamans do their magic. What do shamans do? They predict the movement of game. They predict weather. And they're incredibly adept at choosing clients who will get better. Now, if you had an insight into the future, these three accomplishments would be trivial in the extreme. And we are very naive about how imprisoned by language and cultural assumption we are. The reason psychedelics are so important is because they dissolve cultural programming. This is also why they are such political dynamite. Every government on this planet, Marxist, fascist, socialist, democratic, industrial, whatever, is extraordinarily alarmed by the thought that its citizens would seek to step outside the idols of the tribe. And yet this is precisely what psychedelics do. They restore you to your prehistorical humanness, before propaganda, before monotheism, before monogamy, before urbanism, before standing armies, before slavery, before phonetic alphabets, before all the forces that have degraded us and made us so neurotic. So this is one book of many, several that I've written, and sometimes with co-authors. I think we're peeping over the wall at a new world of human possibility. I am incredibly optimistic. I hail the chaos of history because I believe that it precedes the revelation of an enormous protean form that has been moving toward union with our species since the belt of Africa, at least. History cannot go on for decades or centuries or millennia. History is a self-limiting process, and we're at the end of the line. We are facing a bifurcation that leads either to extinction or hyperspace. It's a mental test. It's a test of our existential validity and our intelligence. And I believe that as primates, we love a good fight. The pressure is coming on. And psychedelics, which have just arrived on the Western agenda in the last 100 years, I mean, mescaline was isolated in 1888. Harmine was discovered in 1928, LSD in 37, DMT in 56, all made illegal in 66. Science has not finished with this matter. Science has attempted to sweep it under the rug because the cheerful assumption of scientific objectivity is absolutely inapplicable to this situation. So in this culminating moment of cultural crisis that Western science and industrialism have handed us, anthropology brings the news that in the jungles, in the rainforests, people are probing and exploring titanically alien dimensions that we of the rational scientific stripe can barely conceive of. And now you may find this all difficult to swallow. That's all very well. And you may wish to sneer it out of existence. That's fine too. But we're not talking about fairies or flying saucers here. Intellectual honesty demands that you get loaded before you judge this, because this is what we're talking about, the nature of an experience. This is not rhetoric, and it's easily done. Psychedelics work. Your positivism will not be sufficient to hold it back. We are on the brink of discovering an entirely new world, and it's happened before. Don't forget that it's only been 500 years, 400 years since we discovered the lost half of the planet. Our sophistication is imaginary. There's more to be known than is known. And the frontier lies in the mind, in the imagination. Blake understood this. The divine imagination. We are creatures of the imagination. And our sojourn in matter as primates lasts no more than 500,000 years. We're at the end of our makers. They hadn't a clue. And this is the real thing, folks. I never would have thought it possible. I thought that you could search the world for fairies, elves, UFOs, spirits, ghosts, and gods and come away empty-handed if you kept your categories tight. It turns out the world is not only stranger than we suppose, it is stranger than we can suppose. And that gives a lot of permission for supposing. So I hope you'll read True Hallucinations and check it out. Check it out. This is big news. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. If I'm right, the world will never be the same. It's a long shot, granted, but the stakes are the destiny of life on this planet. So it behooves us to check it out. Thank you very much. I'm sorry there weren't more laughs. The size of such a crowd must have made me a little nervous. Usually I go for the yucks, but since we're far from my home, I sort of, I guess, am swept with a kind of missionary zeal to...
And I got to yell. Therefore I said
to the chase,
but
dear.
it's like manifestation. We could manifest anything. It was like Mario. You talk about the Philosopher's Stone. It was like holding in your hands, and you can actually shape.
Yes, well, the mushroom said to me, it's the hands. I said, what do you want with us? And it said, you have hands. It said, we together, my knowledge, your hands, we can escape from three-dimensional space. Let me point out, I mean, not all psychedelics are like this. I mean, I'm very well familiar with ayahuasca, which is another exotic, deep jungle hallucinogen. Ayahuasca is feminine, nurturing. It's about water. It's about birth. It's about acceptance and balance. DMT and psilocybin are science fiction. They're hortatory. You see enormous machines around alien stars. It can show you the history of the galaxy. And you can say, well, it's just a hallucination. Well, who can tell? Its impact is as though it were real. I mean, I believe that quantum physics is on the brink of concluding that information is non-local. The mushroom told me this in 1971. It said, by means impossible for you to understand, we are in contact with all members of our species throughout the galaxy. Information is transduced instantaneously. We have seen the rise, flourishing, and fall of 100,000 civilizations over 2 billion years. And when you start thinking about it, of course, if there is intelligence in the galaxy, and if it can reach starflight, then there must be a hegemony of organized intelligence. But it's nothing so banal as flying saucers peopled by silver beings with an interest in our gross industrial output or anything like that. The trick with an alien is to recognize you're in the presence of it. The mushroom, I believe, is a reasonable candidate for an extraterrestrial life form. I could argue it here tonight, but it would take too much time. All this kind of stuff is gone through in the books. But I just see our civilization and our categories and our science and so forth and so on as incredibly pedestrian, narrow-minded, and unconnected with the real mystery of being. I mean, the soul is haunted. There are whisperings from the distant stars, whisperings from the earth. This all has to be sorted out. I mean, I don't think we should go soft-headed and gaga here. I think we should use scientific rationalism, but not the pretentious kind of defense of orthodoxy and constipation that has come to characterize that term. I mean, science should glorify in the mystery of the universe rather than try to defend its own very limited intellectual turf. Yes, over here. How science maintains the fiction of an objective reality. Science is incredibly naive about the role of language. I mean, the world is not made of quarks or electrons or stuff. That's ridiculous. The world is made of language. That's all you'll ever know. Who has seen a quark or an electron? Or, the world is made of language. And a culture cannot exist outside the van of its linguistic structures. So what Wittgenstein talked about what he called the unspeakable. That's what we're talking about here. I mean, when you plunge into the DMT space, well, you cannot give an account later because there was not one thing in there that is referent to anything in this world. There is not past or future. There is not up or down. There is not thing and witness. There is absolutely nothing familiar. But it is not a white light. It is not a plenum, an undifferentiated something. It is, in fact, a world of incredibly multiplistic and complex phenomena, things springing into existence, moving around, merging, changing. Well, the important thing, I think, is to be able to describe it. Once we can describe something, then we can begin to approach it, approximate it, make a metaphor. Science is horrified of psychedelic states because you can't explore them by sacrificing rats. And however satisfying it may be, you can't even explore them by sacrificing graduate students. You, lab chief, you must get loaded and go and come back and give an account. And that's just absolutely horrifying. That violates all the rubrics of science. But, the news out of quantum physics for 45 years is that the independent observer is a fiction, that observer and thing observed are inextricably intertwined, but the news hasn't reached biology, still less psychology. And so, the very core of science, physics, has yielded to the utterly weird. I mean, quantum physics holds propositions far nuttier than anything said here tonight. And, as recently as 75 years ago, physics was the paradigm of the sciences. In physics, theory and experimental data sometimes agree with each other out to 5 decimal places. I mean, psychology, eat your heart out. But now, physics has just become hallucinogenic, virtually. I mean, we have non-local information, we have time running backwards, we have singularities galore. the intellectual enterprise is becoming more and more psychedelic, but we're like the peasants in Kafka's castle. We see the great ones moving on their sleighs to and from the castle, but we don't know what's going on up there. Well, what's going on up there is that 2,000 years of Western thinking is discovered to be woefully inadequate and, in fact, utterly bankrupt for any purpose other than the producing of overpriced appliances. I mean, science is due for some serious revision, and it dealt with the easiest problems first. What is matter? What's the nature of a ball bearing rolling down a slope? Now we're ready to tackle questions like, what is language? What is the imagination? And it's going to require a different order of hypothesis and a different style of discovery. The myth of the neutral experimenter is out the drain. We are part of the world. All boundaries are delusion. All boundaries are conventions of local languages and local assumptions. The truth is the world is a holographic plenum. It's all and everything. And that's not simply rhetoric. That's a fact to be made real by finding a way into hyperspace, first as individuals, and that's easy, exploring psychedelic substances, but more importantly then, as a culture, because the continued practice of culture as we've known it is going to shove us all into either extinction or hideously toxified low awareness lives. We must admit that the grand enterprise of Western civilization has run aground, and that it's not for no reason that the news comes from the rainforest now of an entirely other way to approach the experience of being and the understanding of nature, to speechify the system, the business I'm in, yes. Doing it? Well, the book is an arrow. It says, go this way. It doesn't say what you will find. I want to hear what you find. I want to be joined. I want a body of understanding. I want other people to say what they think it is. We need to build a consensus about this. What we have now is essentially the notebooks of explorers, but we do not have yet a map of the territory. It will take more explorers, more accounts. So people must do the work, and they must pay attention. The idea that these things are somehow frivolous, hedonic, escapist, these are just smears launched by those who have no idea what they're talking about. Because this is a spiritual path that works, it is incredibly challenging and difficult. I mean, if you do psychedelics as I suggest you do them, which is occasionally and at heroic doses and in silent darkness, I guarantee your categories will be stretched and blown. I mean, the best technique for avoiding deep psychedelic experiences is noisy social environments dense with social signaling. I mean, I have nothing against the club scene and all that, but I just go with cannabis. I wouldn't dream of mixing these mega hallucinogens with a social scene. I mean, if you do it right, you're rooted to the floor. You're not moving. And this is how shamans do it. There are too many people running around passing themselves off as experts on the psychedelic experience who have never gotten beyond the training wheels stage with this stuff. I mean, you have to, we used to have a rule, if you don't think you did too much, you didn't do enough. And I grant you, it's not for everybody. This boundary dissolution, which is an inevitable part of it, some people are having a hard time keeping boundaries in place, damaged by bad upbringing or sexual trauma or something like that. This is not the calling for them. This is a demanding and athletic situation, comparable to ocean racing or rock climbing or something like that. But for the healthy, inquisitive, mature person, this is real religion, not a bunch of theological do's and don'ts, but the felt presence of the wholly other, which was Rudolf Otto's definition of the sacred, the wholly other. And these psychedelics deliver us into the presence of that. I think I'm to sign books. Am I right? Am I right? Oh, this person is frantic to make a statement. Oh, I was certainly influenced by Leary as an undergraduate. I mean, probably had he not been there, I would never have done these things. But now he's a personal acquaintance of mine, and I don't think he would be terribly offended if I tell you that to this day, he's simply a behavioral psychologist from Harvard. There's not a spiritual atom in the man. He doesn't view it as I view it. He psychologizes it. As far as Groff is concerned, he also is a personal friend of mine. And if you read his book, which one is it? Is it Beyond LSD, Beyond something? Anyway, he says every form of psychic power, every paranormal phenomenon ever cataloged has been known to occur under the influence of LSD. And I quite agree with that. I mean, Groff developed holotropic breathing only because LSD was legislated out of existence. I tend to have contempt for my contemporaries. It's a terrible habit. But, you know, I'd much rather read John Chrysostom or Plato or Plotinus than Leary or Groff, because I can hang out with those guys and quickly satisfy myself that they don't know any more about it than I do. That's that, I suppose. All right, let's sign some books, okay?
What about Carl Pribram then?
Carl Pribram. Well, he's a brain scientist who created the holographic theory of mind, and with Dennis Gabor, right? I think that was a tremendous step forward. What these people tend to do is they tend to, like blind men feeling the elephant, they tend to concentrate on very specialized aspects of the phenomenon. What I'm trying to do is really understand it in all of its adumbrations. If you read all of my books, there are tough sections on pharmacology, neurophysiology, organismic philosophy, hologrammatic theory, anthropology, so forth and so on. I mean, you really, the sum total of human knowledge has to be brought to bear on this phenomenon in order to even begin to get a grip on it. I mean, I think this is the greatest challenge, the greatest intellectual frontier that we have ever faced. And I think if we meet this challenge, literally, the kingdom of heaven is within reach. Blake knew this. He was the great prophet of all this. We shall all be together in the divine imagination if we can correctly thread our way through the labyrinth of profane history. And now there's light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, we are the generation of people who are going to witness either the ascent of the species into hyperspace or the scrubbing up and washing out of the natural laboratory after intelligence is deemed a hideous failure. It's a human decision, and the fate of novelty in the universe, therefore, rests in our unsteady hands. Thank you very much.